I will just say that we've got this this panel then on the history of poverty, looking at the history of poverty in new ways. And so I will really hand over to our first speaker then, who is David Hitchcock. David, I'll hand over to you, let you take it from there then, I think.
Okay, thanks so much. Hopefully you can hear me and see me and all of that. Great. So my presentation sort of starts formal and gets less and less formal as we go. So I've got some remarks where I'll try and gesture generally at my opinion on where the history of vagrancy is going. I've got a few opening remarks about kind of the panel itself, very brief, and then I'll take you through a little bit of the sort of emerging historiography of the early modern history of vagrancy, and then I'll sort of signpost a little bit of what I'm working on now. So that's sort of my plan. First of all, I mean, just thank you to everyone for coming along to this roundtable panel on new directions in the history of poverty. This is about as much of a book launch, as it were, for the Routledge history of poverty as I think we'll ever be able to have, at least in the foreseeable future. And don't worry, it won't really feel like a book launch in that sense. And in that spirit, Routledge gave us a discount code, which you can feel free to avail yourselves of, which will persist kind of into August, and which will allow you to get a bit of money off the handbook if you're interested in picking up a copy. And I should say that that discount should work on the ebook version of this as well, which is less expensive. So what I'm going to do today is focus on, as I said, on vagrancy, on its evolving definition in the historiography, and on the sort of interesting, almost sort of renaissance, if you will, that I think it's having in the wider scholarship. I've seen a really impressive amount of work come out in only the last few years on vagrancy, and I think that's a really good sort of development in the larger history of poverty. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the challenges of defining vagrancy, particularly early modern vagrancy. I think we could stretch it back sort of beyond the 15th century if we wanted to, but that's sort of where I'm going to position this definition. And I'm going to sort of start with the sort of reality that that sort of our definition of vagrancy that we've inherited as historians. We've inherited it from essentially from hostile contemporaries, from a huge discourse around kind of the undeserving poor, which reliably defined vagrancy, not just in England or in Europe, but actually sort of in a wider context as a state of mobile, mendacious, which is to say dishonest and idle poverty. And I make the case in my chapter in this book that all the legal definitions of vagrancy and all the lists of prohibited occupations and so on, which they elucidate, are based on this kind of fundamental initial definition, on what I would describe as an idleness of a form forbidden to those who are impoverished. Okay, so there are certain groups or segments of society where idleness is clearly much less of a problem. Generally speaking, the wealthier one is, the less likely that someone is going to have a strong opinion on whether or not you work. But at this sort of lowest segment of the social order, among the mobile and homeless poor, idleness is for contemporaries the central concern. And I argue that we can't really understand the larger history or the histories of poverty or state formation or indeed labor and work until we unpack the histories of vagrancy first and place those histories at the center of our explanations. I think if we're not paying attention to vagrancy, we're missing a trick. So, you know, what it meant to be vagrant was defined in opposition, arguably, to a kind of sedentarist metaphysics, and that's a phrase from Tim Cresswell, who's a geographer of mobility, and it was heavily predicated on certain assumptions about the way society ought to look, right? Private property, settled familial normalcy, and the sort of communal production of social belonging in the parish, of the parish, right? foreign beggars, outcomers, strangers, those who were seemingly able-bodied but unemployed, those who were outcast via disease or migration or wounded or disabled in body and mind. These are all the sort of targets of these proclamations and statutes. This is the sort of body of individuals who I think will reliably see them labeled as vagrant. And what I want to do here is I want to just sort of take the definition of vagrancy in pieces and consider the ways that we have to sort of look at it in turn. So first and foremost is this concept of the vagrant poor as idle, right? That they were somehow capable of work but refused it. I sort of elaborated on this a little bit already, but one of the most fundamental elements of this is that begging, whether licensed or not, was just not reliably seen as work. Okay, you might see someone's occupation listed in a burial register as beggar or elsewhere as sort of pauper or beggar, but this is just not in the larger early modern discourse of the period understood as work per se. Second, defining someone as vagrant necessarily made a problem out of their very mobility. And this often takes form in settlement forms, which Naomi will know quite a lot about, having written about them, passports, begging tokens, censuses like the Norwich census for the poor, and so on and so forth. A large range of the sort of edifices of control and punishment which target the poor focus on this second part of the definition, on controlling the mobility of the poor in particular. Finally, I would say defining a vagrant or the vagrant mandates a kind of generalized, institutionalized distrust of impoverished and mobile individuals in the first instance. So there's a kind of imagined moral hazard here in the question of whether an itinerant pauper ought to be assisted or not. And this was managed collectively by essentially disbelieving the circumstances presented by the begging poor in the first instance, okay? So if you believed, to make this concrete, if you believed the claims of every poor person who made a sort of claim on your welfare, on your attention, on your parish rates, the assumption was that you would be, that sort of society would be unable to sustain that level of generalized charity. And so instead, begging is made sort of morally suspect. The default position is less likely to sort of be trusting of those narratives, more likely, certainly in the cultural sort of edifice here, to disbelieve those narratives. And that's where the sort of assumed mendacity of the poor comes in, their untrustworthiness. The other thing, excuse me. The other sort of set of ways that we should define vagrancy are more familiar to us as sort of practicing historians. So vagrancy was also profoundly gendered. I mean, Lee Byers' important book, Masterless Men, right? I mean, he does mention female vagrancy in that book to a certain extent, but the vast majority of his material focuses on the sort of labor problems inherent in late 16th and early 17th century vagrancy. I've personally gone the other direction and looked at masterless women, which I would argue is a much more important sort of phenomenon for us to unpack in the period after the English Civil War. And I've suggested that male vagrancy, broadly speaking, is a problem of labor. That's fair enough. But that female vagrancy is better understood as a problem of the life cycle. I'm revisiting that now. I'm not convinced that's nearly as neat a summary of the conditions on the ground as I might wish, but it still works as a generalization. So vagrancy is gendered. We need to remember that when we're trying to define it. Contemporaries understood it as a gendered phenomenon. They understood that female domestic servants were in sort of immediate danger, particularly when they lost their place in service, of being made vagrant, or they might become pregnant, or some other form of rupture might occur in the sort of predictable pattern or the imagined predictable pattern of their life course. And these moments of vulnerability were acutely understood as sort of a moment where vagrancy was a danger. And women did make very sophisticated use of this. So I found a really brilliant petition in the 1680s where a woman by the name of Elizabeth Pickington petitioned for sort of parish relief. Her husband was imprisoned, I think for debt, and quotes, having the ill fortune of being drawn into company of diverse lewd and wicked persons. So her husband was had misspent his money, classic lewd liver, right? And she and her 6 very small children had nowhere to go. And without your worship's order, she pled, The parish would not grant relief for her or her poor children, nor a house to hide their heads in, whereby they may be prevented from being wandering beggars, and so a scandal to a Christian kingdom. So this is a moment where inside the petition, Elizabeth, makes use of a very sophisticated understanding of the threat of vagrancy to basically importune the parish to provide direct sort of assistance to her, a house over the head of her and her children in the first instance. Second, and you can sort of see this in the image on the slide, vagrancy is also tightly connected to the emergence of racial thinking. And there's much more work to do here, despite some really good recent scholarship on this score. When vagrancy was associated with ethnicity, it was often described as an inherent characteristic of a race, i.e. this or that race was inherently idle or lazy. And this is rather than as a kind of lapse. And in this character judgment, we see a kind of precursor to eugenics and social Darwinism. And in John Thomas Smith's Vagabondiana, which is actually where this image is from, the description of Charles McGee, who is the fellow you see here, who's a one-eyed sort of elderly black man who stood begging at Ludgate Hill in London in the early sort of decade of the 19th century. This description sort of suggests that McGee was successful enough at his trade to have multiple suits of clothing and to take Sundays off to go to church and then the pub. And Smith's description of McGee sort of suggests that it's his Jamaicanness, if you will, that makes him so successful at sort of standing and collecting his daily due. So you can sort of see the racial thinking in active descriptions of the begging poor across the period as well. Vagrancy is also defined geographically, and I will say a little bit less about this, but it's associated as sort of byproduct of unproductive places and spaces, particularly kind of forests and fenlands are understood as spaces which produced a kind of predisposition in people. They would be bred up to be idle and lazy. Fenlands, the discourse around fens is really full of this. And we have some good scholarship on this. Eric Ashe has looked at this in The Draining of the Fens. There's a range of geographers, historical geographers, who have touched on this. And I think, again, a lot more work to do about vagrancy as a sort of geographically specific discourse about an environment or a space. So those are just some of the ways that vagrancy, I think, needs to be defined, right? In gendered terms, in racial terms, in geographic terms. I could go on, I could do an entire paper about the ways that we might look at vagrancy in cultural terms, but I think that would take me too long and too far away from what I'd like to accomplish here. So the second thing I'd like to do is try and summarize, I'm being a bit neat here, but the sort of homeless historiography, right? So where are we in the scholarship at the moment, in my view, when it comes to the history of vagrancy? So for much of the 20th century, I would argue that scholarship on vagrancy can be broadly divided into two camps. There's the sort of legislative and social history accounts, which sort of take their definitions of vagrancy from legislation, usually aimed at the vagrant poor. And then there's the sort of literary studies, which tended to focus on the rich genre of rogue literature, and sort of mining it either credulously or critically for information about the cultural preoccupations of Europeans. These two camps are often traced back to the Webbs on one hand, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and to Frank Chandler on the other. In both cases, they have their flaws. It's rich, a really rich vein of scholarship. But in the first instance, so the Webbs, that strand of scholarship produced an enormous range of really impressive, empirically minded, sensitive histories of poor relief, poverty, vagrancy, and so on. But it also produced a kind of predisposition to see vagrancy as primarily a problem of demography and sort of externalized macroeconomic forces, which I think naturalizes it, which is something that the volume that we're all in, John, Julie, and myself, really sort of militates against the naturalization of poverty. And it also sort of, I think, underestimates the complexity of the various causes of vagrancy, which again, if you look at the causes of homelessness today, like they're way more complex than just economics writ large, right? We would never accept that as just a kind of explanation for why a given person was homeless. So I don't think we should accept it in the past either. And the other strand, again, theoretically very rich, a huge range of contributions to our understanding of the origins of the novel, of the picaresque, of humor, of, it's a really rich field, sort of rogue studies or sort of literary criticism with respect to the history of vagrancy. But there it tends to overdetermine the performativity of vagrancy. And at its peak, it imagined into existence an Elizabethan underworld we don't have any archival basis for sort of believing in. Yes, there were organized criminal gangs on occasion. No, there was no elaborate kind of network of to the best of our knowledge of kind of criminals that pretended to be beggars and had a huge hierarchy suspiciously inverted version of the sort of social order. And also both of these strands of scholarship tended to take the threat of vagrancy as read, i.e. that they just sort of assumed that it was accurate that vagrants presented and were a kind of threat to settled communities, and didn't interrogate the kind of that sort of part of the scholarship. And then, as I've hopefully shown, there's enormous problems of definition here as well, including just the sheer number of ways that different bits of this scholarship have defined what vagrancy is: crime of status, legal category, economic state, psychological predisposition in certain racial groups, proto-racialized category in and of itself, repository of emerging police powers, irredeemable lumpen proletariat. Like, you read Marx, and like Marx hates vagrants too. Like, it's unbelievable kind of how many different versions of this there are. Okay, so where are we at the moment? I think we are looking at a really important moment for the history of vagrancy in the next few years and in the last few. Vagrancy's global and interconnected history is really coming out in the scholarship at the moment. So too is its relationship to the sort of ideological commitments behind police power. I read a really good book recently about the relationship between early modern, the sort of discourse of vagrancy in early modern England and police, the sort of policing impulse. I think vagrancy is factoring increasingly into Atlantic and imperial history. European notions of vagabondage and vagrancy are mapped onto other societies, other social practices and cultural systems of mobility. I mean, this is most obvious in British India, right? In the sort of imperial administration of British India, where you see British vagrancy laws applied to sacred and secular traditions of Indian mobility and mendicancy. And it's just such a poor fit in all respects. There's also, as I mentioned, this emerging relationship to theories of race, to eugenics thinking. I think there's much more work to do there as well. And I would suggest mobility studies is incredibly healthy. If you sort of look at the sort of state of play of many of the kind of interdisciplinary journals that focus on mobility, I think plebeian mobility and vagrancy and homelessness more broadly are starting to make a real comeback in that scholarship too. And I've just sort of briefly outlined a few of the books that I think are making those contributions. Again, sort of shamelessly suggesting that some of this is coming from the Routledge History of Poverty, but by no means all of it. Really path-breaking volume from the early 2000s called Cast Out, and some really great scholarship coming out of the United States as well on this. Sort of scholarship on poverty and vagrancy in the US is actually leading a renaissance there in many ways in terms of early Republican social history, sort of early histories of the United States. It's coming back in a really robust way, and the sort of new history of capitalism coming out of the United States scholarship is taking these matters seriously as well. So very briefly now, where next? And then a very, very short gesture at what I'm doing at the moment. I think we still need to understand vagrancy as contingent, but fundamentally tied to poverty, and no less real for its mutability. I think it's extremely important that no matter how flexible a definition we adopt of it, no matter which forms of primary or secondary material we use to excavate it, no matter whether we're interested in lived experience or ideology or discourse, we need to remember that vagrancy is right next to poverty, and it very rarely diverges from that. And that claims made on a sort of vagrant state, which sort of come from a position where the individual making the claims is not poor. I think we need to be very careful about giving the label of vagrancy to those claims. I think that's something else. So maybe it's incognito social investigation, maybe it's a particular kind of romantic itinerancy, but I'm not sure I would give it the word vagrancy as a kind of label. There's much to do still on empire and colonialism and on unfree labor. I would point people to Claire Anderson's work in particular, which is really sort of expanding this at the moment. I think literary scholars are leading in terms of theoretical contributions, but sort of typically speaking, they are not. They would need to play catch up with historians in terms of lived experience and context setting. And to me, not a lot of people are disagreeing here. It's I think a very healthy field. Okay, just by way of wrapping up now, I just wanted to kind of give you a taste of what I'm working on at the moment. I'm doing a couple different things, but I've become obsessed in the last month or so by this project looking at dying homeless in early modern England. And what I'm doing is I'm basically increasingly enamored of the idea of understanding vagrancy as a series of moments, not as a sort of solid state, but as a kind of ephemeral, as I mentioned, deeply contingent thing which people could fall into, fall out of, at various points in their lives. I think that's a much more holistic way of understanding it. And one of the moments I want to start really, this kind of journey focusing on is death, dying while vagrant or dying while homeless. And naturally, I've gravitated towards burial records in order to do this work. And it was initially prompted by the realization that Thomas Lacare's recent book on the work of the dead just doesn't do nearly enough on the work of the homeless dead and the work of those who are poor who are dead. And that was a huge gap in an otherwise very impressive book. And so I started looking into this, and lo and behold, these burial records are actually an exceptional resource for studying the moment when people died while homeless. So to characterize what I'm doing, I'm just databasing it. I'm neck deep in Find My Past records. I'm trying to kind of get as many of these into a coherent, usable database for myself and others as I can. And in terms of the type of information I'm getting a good distribution of information on sort of gender. So we can do some gender. Number of men dying, number of women dying homeless, sometimes age, date of burial, reliably I'm getting, place of burial. Name often, but not always, a lot of anonymous burials of the vagrant poor, as you might expect. And then I'm getting little glosses as well, little comments, as you can see here, inside some of the sort of facsimile examples. And these are, I think, a really rich resource. No one's used them, to the best of my knowledge. At the moment, there are some PhD students working on this sort of stuff right now, and I think that's really exciting. But in terms of published work, and certainly book-length work and that sort of thing, I'm not aware of anyone sort of looking very, very sort of systemically at this yet. And you can see the kind of notes that these parish officials are leaving in these burial registers. I mean, my favorite so far is Old Mary at the top here, who died in 1814. We don't know her surname, we're told, right? Because from the time that she was found, and she was found in a barn, she was incapable of telling it. So we're imagining, that she could maybe barely kind of get out her first name, but she couldn't give her full name. And she sort of died in a shed nearby Bolstonfield barn. And then she ended up, she was moved from there to the workhouse, and she died there. So we get an incredible amount of detail about Mary's last moments and her burial. And that's the kind of stuff that I'm really fascinated by. Down lower on here, you can see we get a lot of when children die, if you'll excuse me, we usually get that information. Officials will be careful to note that. Sometimes very assiduous officials will even note cause of death. So vagrants dying of old age, or I mean, this isn't a vagrant who dies of this, but there's a brewer down here who dies of inward bruising, which I mean, okay. I'd like to know a bit more about that. So I think, these are a really rich resource that I'm kind of obsessed with at the moment. In terms of conclusions, I don't want to sort of give any formal conclusions. I think the history of vagrancy and poverty more broadly is in a very good place at the moment in sort of pre-modern scholarship. I think a lot of the most exciting work is actually PhD students. I'm seeing folks who aren't even necessarily focused on vagrancy per se, ask questions that, to my mind, take them into conceptual territory I would normally associate with the history of vagrancy. And that to me is exciting. That suggests to me that it has sort of reached a mature status as a part of a larger historiography of poverty in sort of early modern England more broadly, and I think increasingly elsewhere too. I've been to a few colloquiums sort of organized out of Europe where vagrancy in particular has been presented on and taken very seriously. So from my perspective, it's broadly speaking good news, and I think I'll just end on that note for now.
Right, thank you, David. That was great. Lots of interesting things in there. And while we're moving on to our next speaker, and John Morgan is setting up his slides, I'll just I'll come back round and apologise for the fact that I forgot to introduce Dave while I was busy thinking about what I'd said before we started recording and afterwards, whether I needed to add anything. It slipped my mind to tell us, of course, that David Hitchcock is Senior Lecturer in History at Canterbury Christchurch University. If you didn't know Dave already from his work with the Social History Society, as one of the co-organisers of this strand, the Welfare Humanitarianism and Social Action strand of the conference, then you will certainly by now, having heard that talk, be aware of his excellent work that he's doing as an early modernist, as a historian of poverty and these broader social questions. Some excellent work on Quakerism and things as well. So we will move on there. What I will quickly remind us is that we've got a kind of consent form that's been shared shared to everybody in the waiting room. That's not something that everybody needs to fill in. That's something that the speakers need to fill in, but you don't need to if you are just asking a question, for example, in the session. As I said, if you do have something you perhaps chip in with a question that you don't want included in the recording, let us know, but you don't have to worry about filling anything in. So we will move on to our next speaker, to John Morgan. So Johnny, are you able to get your slides up? If we get those up, I will mention that then we've got John Morgan, who's a lecturer at Bristol University, who, to give us the idea that we are a kind of good interdisciplinary panel here. John is, of course, a historian, but I think not teaching in the history department at Bristol. So coming from different sides here with an environmental history approach to the topic. So I'll leave you to get started then.
Thanks so much, George, and thank you, everyone. I have been in 8 hours of exam boards in the last 2 days, so I don't have the mental capacity to be as eloquent as Dave and as Julia will be in their more kind of off-the-cuff and ad-libbed papers. So I'm just going to read my paper. I don't think we've got closed captions on, but I am just going to share in the chat right now basically the script. So if you want to do kind of conference karaoke and just read along, if that helps you, then please by all means do. And my paper should be about like 15 or 16 minutes. So if I'm going over, George, please cut me off. So I'd like to thank you first for the opportunity to participate in the roundtable. My contribution is about poverty's environmental histories in early modern England, and how those histories can help us find common ground between social and environmental history. I am by no means a historian of poverty, but I have been working on various topics that connect environments and their social histories. And so when Dave asked whether I could contribute to the Poverty Handbook, I found this a challenge, but a really useful challenge. It was a challenge that required for me working in a slightly different way than I have done before, rather than sort of starting with something environmental and trying to understand its human consequences or human responses to it. This was an opportunity to start with people, with poor people in particular, and think from them outwards. And so the paper is really an opportunity for me to share with you how I went about that task and outline where I think environmental histories of early modern poverty can kind of maybe begin from or continue from and be useful. And then I wondered maybe actually in the roundtable if people who have expertise in other geographies and other chronologies might want to kind of chip in and think about how some of the things I say may or may not apply to the kinds of work that they do. Writing the social history of environments, or indeed the environmental history of social life, can be like walking a tightrope, I think. At their core, social and environmental history are potentially antithetical. if the task of social history remains to rescue people, their ordinariness and their everyday lives from the enormous condescension of posterity, then we might look at environmental history and think of it as the condescending discipline par excellence. So often the goals of environmental history are to decenter the human, to think in inhuman registers and on inhuman timescales about really massive things like climate and atmospheric circulation, or really tiny things like diseases and microorganisms, all things which are very much not people. These two positions, these two ways of characterizing environmental history and social history are obviously caricatures. And there is a long and relatively deep tradition of what we might call socio-environmental history. But I still think any study that seeks to understand the social history of environments needs to find a scale at which to operate, which can do justice to humans as both people and species, and environments as both the fabric of human life and kind of a vast web of more than human stuff. That's about as good a definition of environment as I can come up with. And I think I found at least a way to start thinking about that in some work by the geographer Mike Hume on his recent book on climate. In Weathered Cultures of Climate, Hume, I think, sensitively traces knowledges and practices of climate, showing us that climate is both material and imagined, and that a crudely kind of interactionist model of climate affecting society, or vice versa, doesn't really work if we want to understand how climate is constructed and how people experience it. Instead, for Hume, we should think about climate and society almost at the same time. So following this, I think, really good example, we might then focus on lived environments. A focus on how environments are lived foregrounds experience and agency, the strategies and accommodations that people practiced in order to dwell within their environments, as well as how those environments kind of registered on them in turn. And by insisting on environments plural, as I'll try and do as often as possible, I think we can keep the variety of subjective environmental experiences and the multiplicity of scales at which environments are configured in our focus. So I take environments to be concentric and overlapping, and that they can be grasped at a variety of scales. And I think for us to focus on the lived environments of poverty, I think we need to kind of narrow some of that down, because it's all a bit woolly so far, into some maybe generic scales with which to organize our analysis, scales which can do justice to the potentially contradictory focuses of our two subdisciplines. And for the early modern period, I think we can kind of usefully identify three scales at which environments might be considered to have been lived. And I don't intend these to be kind of prescriptive or restrictive in any way, but I think they are useful in the context of early modernity at least. And the scales are of climates, landscapes, and bodies. Can you see the three words at the top of the screen? Because I've got like a bar covering them on my screen. I don't know if that comes through to you. It's all good, thank you. So I think by using these three scales, we can grasp different intersections between the human and the more than human, and observe sometimes some kind of feedbacks and mutualities where they exist. So in climate, I think we have the opportunity to consider one of the kind of most important macro contexts of the early modern period, the Little Ice Age. In climate, we also have a lens through which to consider the moralized and sacralized world of weather and meteorology, and thus how ideas of poverty interacted with ideas about divine providence. Landscape, I think, helps us foreground how people lived and made a living from the world around them. It's a scale that offers an attempt to look at social practices and rituals, routine economic activity, and the various forms of shift that characterized often the lives of the early modern poor. I think also the land helps us bring into focus a world of laws, of borders, and of enforcement, and thus into practices of inclusion and exclusion. And the final kind of smallest scale of focus of the body is where environments registered on people, where the socially differentiated experiences of lived environments kind of made their marks viscerally almost, and where the poor were most often precisely defined, observed, and regulated. And I think by considering these scales together, that hopefully will bring me towards some kind of coherent reflection on poverty, environments, and notions of naturalness, which I'll try and return to at the end. So I'm just going to go through these kind of three scales one by one now. So climate in the early modern period drove cycles of plenty and want. In an economy in which up to 70% of labouring families' budgets were spent on food, and that food was provisioned locally and seasonally, often climatic impacts on harvests could push families into poverty. But we all know, and Mike Hume tells us, that climate is not just a material influence on everyday life. In early modern England, the vicissitudes of weather were encoded culturally and met by moralizing expectations of poverty and charity. Cold weather was, of course, interpreted providentially by both Protestants and Catholics as a sign of divine judgment. It made for popular news, and authors of cheap print glossed their dramatic tales of country hardship with exhortations to charity. We wish that rich men's charity may not have been as cold and harsh as the season, opined an anonymous pamphleteer during the cold winter of 1676. As kind of moralizing statements like this suggest, cold winters and associated hard times provided an opportunity for the performance of charity and the rehearsal of obligations. Moments of crisis provided opportunities for local lords to demonstrate their beneficence through hospitality, and parishes might give out discretionary relief. Hospitality in hard times was then an expectation. When the tenants of the manor of Hunton recited their customs in 1598, they complained that the Lord had failed in his duties to provide hospitality and relieve the poor after the series of deficient harvests across the middle years of the 1590s. While the efficacy of kind of ad hoc discretionary charity in these kinds of circumstances has been questioned as a kind of material relief to endemic poverty in the countryside, weather nevertheless shaped the social and cultural script of the English countryside. And that was a script that was characterized often by obligation, deference, and expectation. Climate and meteorological forces shaped the experience of poverty, perhaps on a large scale and in general, but I think it was in the landscape that early modern people made a living, and as such, the experience of poverty varied sharply due to the nature of places, and this is something that Dave was touching on earlier. Environments both expose and afford, that is, they can expose people to certain risks and hazards or provide certain affordances in the form of flora, fauna, and minerals. But landscapes, flora, and fauna didn't determine the experience of poverty in and of themselves. Regimes to regulate the exploitation of common resources by in and out groups governed exactly who could take what from where and when. These rules are then crucial in understanding how landscapes were lived by the poor. Rights to take firewood and turf were often formalized as a kind of practical charity, in Sarah Birtle's memorable phrase, offering the poor a flexible baseline of provision without conferring on them kind of more wide-ranging entitlements to things like monetary relief. These kind of systems of management, of managing access to resources, remind us of the importance of belonging to the experience of poverty. Those who did not belong encountered the restrictive nature of these various customs. And I think given that much of this kind of work of provisioning from the immediate environment was undertaken by women, we really need to be alive to how environments were lived through age and particularly gender. It was female gleaners and foragers who were gleaning wheat or foraging for wood, for example, who would find themselves on the shifting front lines of discretion as customary rights to make a living in the landscape shrunk and contracted across the 17th century. For those who didn't have to negotiate this kind of complex web of entitlement, discretion, and surveillance that could shape practices of foraging and gleaning, so we're thinking middling and elite people here, making a living in the landscape must have seemed, and certainly did seem to them, that the poor weren't somehow close to nature. And here I think it's instructive to think about the dialogue from King Lear between poor Tom and Lear. Here, Shakespeare is satirizing elite ideas about poverty, as Edgar, who's the outcast son of the Earl of Gloucester, disguises himself as an archetypal beggar called Poor Tom. Edgar disguises himself as Tom by almost weather-beating himself with, quote, presented nakedness to outface the winds and persecutions of the sky. Foolishly, Lear falls for this disguise, and his immediate empathy for poor Tom stems from a very similar reading of this kind of nature of poverty. So he says, poor naked wretches, wheresoever you are, abide the pelting of this pitiless storm. How shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and unwindowed and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? And so Edgar, disguised as poor Tom, responds to this, confirming Lear's prejudices and presenting the work of shift, of that gleaning and foraging, as work of kind of constant crisis provisioning from a foul landscape in even fouler weather. And so he says, poor Tom that eats the swimming frog, the toad, the tadpole, the wall-newt and the water, that in the fury of his heart, when the foul fiend rages, eats cow dung for salads, swallows the old rat and the ditch dog, drinks the green mantle of the standing pool, etc., etc. In the minds of Edgar and Lear, to be poor was then to inhabit a poor place and to experience that place entirely viscerally. The inverse of this kind of pessimistic vision was the naturalization of poverty in an orderly, almost bucolic and natural landscape in which kind of simple lives of simple poor people were provisioned from a world of plenty. In her poem on poverty, Margaret Cavendish extols the virtues of the poor who sit in their low thatched houses on but a stump of an old decayed tree, drinking from the springs of great nature and subsisting on roots and herbs, not such as art doth sow, but which in fields do naturally grow. In these idealized visions of poverty, the poor pressed lightly on the land. The settled poor sat on tree stump stools, supping clear stream waters, while the itinerant poor ate filth and offered little resistance when being beaten about by the elements. But as I think the history of poverty actually over a reasonably long period of time shows us, as I've tried to outline so far in the paper, making shift in the landscape using the resources of your local environment was not simply harvesting some natural bounty which was given to one freely. It was the shifting limits of custom and charity which ensured that there was nothing natural about how people might exploit the resources of their immediate landscapes. So now I want to turn to the body, the final scale at which we can understand the environmental history of poverty, maybe usefully. And in doing so, I want to focus on heat and comfort. Attitudes towards different kinds of smoke produced by people heating themselves for comfort demonstrate really clearly, I think, the environmental and aesthetic implications of the proximity to poor bodies in early modern England experienced by those higher up the social hierarchy. In Fume Fugium, an essay against the profusion of smoke in London, John Evelyn complained about the coal smoke that came from what he called the exorbitant increase of tenements, poor and nasty cottages around London, which disgrace and take off from the sweetness and amenity of the environs. In the country, however, in rural landscapes, where the privation experienced by those often very similar poor people, sorry, I've really lost my place there. In the country, where the privation experienced by those same poor people could be woven into an idealistic and more organic social order, wood smoke, so a different kind of smoke, might be a sign of actual social harmony. In 1618, Robert Rees, a provincial antiquary from Preston in Suffolk, noticed that, quote, the rich cannot stand without the poor, and the humble thoughts which smoke from a poor man's cottage are as sweet a sacrifice unto the Lord as the costly perfumes of the prince's palace. So in contrasting these things, we might say as the poor crept closer in the early modern city, such idealistic fantasies became unsustainable for the likes of John Evelyn. Smoke was not sweet when it was in your nose and in your house from dirty sea coal. Close to home, the material realities of privation became a multi-sensory concern for urban elites. The experiences of smoke and smog were, I think as William Cavett shows really nicely in his book, determined by socio-economic status. Enforced cohabitation could drive poor families to light unventilated fires in their search for privacy in ill-equipped charitable housing. So an example from East Claydon in Buckinghamshire saw 4 poor families sharing one church house, which had a single chimney in the 1670s. Their desire for privacy and rooms of their own led each family to light a separate fire around unventilated walls against mottled walls. And as we know, unvented fires are a significant source of indoor air pollution and cause the accumulation of particulate matter in living spaces. And often low quality or poorly prepared fuels can create thick plumes of smoke. So through this kind of thick air of smoky fuels and poorly ventilated rooms, poverty could make itself felt in the lungs of the early modern poor. But I don't want to leave the bodies of the poor and the smoke they inhaled as a story of kind of environmental vulnerability and exposure to hazard that was experienced by kind of ignorant people and somehow unaware of the damage they did to themselves. As Vladimir Yankovic has argued, heating in conditions such as these was a rational economic choice. Early modern physicians were very well aware that the body was susceptible to exposure when it was undernourished, as often many of these poor people may have been. So the choices that poor people made in this example to heat their home and bear the physical cost of smoke inhalation was one that offered them comfort, in Yankovic's terms, on their own terms. So this is not ignorance, it's a choice between, I suppose, as we hear so often today when in the discussions of fuel poverty, between heating and eating, and often heating was the choice that people made. So that's kind of the three pillars of how I think we might do the environmental history of poverty. And I hope that's shown that there is some value in thinking environmentally about poverty in the early modern period. I think these three scales of climate, the landscape, and the body helped us to think about different environments and how they were lived by the early modern poor. I think for social historians, an approach like this maybe highlights how inequalities shape environments and experiences of them. And for environmental historians, I think such an approach helps foreground the gradations of environmental experience within societies and at different scales. I want to end very lastly with an old truism from C.S. Lewis that you will find peppered across environmental historiography. And I think I'm guilty of quoting this myself. And the quote is, "What we call power over nature turns out to be power exercised by some men, people, over others, with nature as its instrument." I think this rings true for the history of poverty. Power over nature is really power exercised by some people over others. But I think the study of poverty also highlights that there's a necessary corollary to this formulation. Power exercised by some people over other people also operates ecologically, both through and on and in nature. And so social inequality creates unequal environments. And my final concluding thought is therefore that there is nothing kind of natural about poverty in the early modern period and perhaps about any other period at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Great paper, John. Yeah, lots to think about there, and the links between those three different scales on which you can think about it's fascinating. I'm sure, like me, other people have got different thoughts that are coming to them. So while we move on to our third speaker, please do feel free to start putting comments or thoughts, questions in the chat, and we will come to them all when we've heard from all three speakers. So our final speaker that we've got then is Dr. Julia McClure, who's lecturer in late medieval and early modern global history at the University of Glasgow. So be interesting to take, we've been looking at the broader, we can go from the body through up to the climate. How broad can we go? Perhaps taking in a global look at poverty and empire. Anyway, Julia, I will hand over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, George, and thanks very much to everyone for organising this panel, for coming along to this panel today. And it's been a really interesting stream by the looks of it on welfare, humanitarianism and social action, and it's great to see that on this programme. So I've taken the invitation that was about sort of having a roundtable on new directions in the history of poverty and sort of reflecting on the publication of the Routledge volume sort of at its word in a very sort of light touch way. I'm not going to give a paper. You can think about this as a kind of seg into the sort of roundtable discussion, which I hope you're all going to participate in. So I kind of just wanted to summarise what I think are the new directions in the history of poverty, and to signpost some of the projects that I've worked on in the last, well, nearly a decade or so, although I don't think we're counting lockdown years anymore, hopefully. And to sort of signpost some of the projects that I've been working with that has given me a chance to sort of develop and think about these new directions in the history of poverty. So to begin with this discussion, I think it's important to reflect on, why are we discussing the history of poverty and new directions? It's not so much because there's been shortfalls in the old histories of poverty, but I think it's important to think about why this question's important to us as a society now. And the answer to this question is that poverty is endemic to our societies, both in the global north and the global south. Although the way in which the nature of poverty is structured, perceived, and experienced varies across context. So the difference between poverty in the global north and the global south, there is a difference, but it's also important to understand the ways in which these poverties are connected. So I think that histories should be having a poverty turn. We've had sort of spatial turns and other turns in the past, but in the last decades, societies have had a poverty turn. So I think history needs to have a poverty turn too. So the political manufacturing of poverty has accelerated in the last decades under neoliberalism and the expansion of austerity politics. The history of poverty is important in this context to understand the deep roots of poverty as a political project, as well as the different genealogies of poverty and the different cultural meanings. So I kind of flagged this point about the different genealogies of poverty. Recently, on my first book, which was on the Franciscan invention of the New World, where I explored the kind of role that Franciscan beliefs about poverty played in kind of influencing the first colonial society. This was of interest to some modern monetary theorists, and I did a podcast for the Modern Monetary Theory, New Money on the Left podcast, and it was interesting to discuss with them the different genealogies of austerity versus other genealogies of intellectual projects of poverty, of which there have been many in the past. So it's interesting to think about these different political projects of poverty in the past as well. So poverty is endemic in our societies, but it's often in the shadows. And I think this is because of an Orwellian doublethink. So poverty has been understood as the antithesis of modernity, and the history of the making of the modern world has often been presented as a progression away from Malthusian poverty traps. And this is despite the fact that I would argue poverty and modernity have actually been co-constitutive. So the intellectual history of this relationship between poverty and modernity, and the Orwellian doublethink that modernity is antithesis to poverty, I think can be traced at least to the Enlightenment, and the ideas that economic improvement and development would somehow end poverty. And Dave and I discussed this in the introduction to the Routledge volume, and it appears elsewhere in other chapters in that volume. So the language of international development replaced colonialism in the post-war period, continuing the expansion of westernization and capitalization, and the myth that industrial-led capitalist expansion would decrease poverty, despite the fact that the social and environmental degradation caused by this expansion often increased poverty. International development was presented as a program of poverty reduction, but it helped expand the racial logic of capitalism, which in turn has continued to create new forms of poverty around the world. So I've got a special edition coming out on this topic in the Journal of Law and Social Justice and Global Development, and it's entitled Beyond Development, the Local Histories of Global Poverty. So if you're interested in that, then do please look out for the publication of that special edition, hopefully in the fall this year. So the main interventions of my work on the history of poverty, and also I should say, I also work on inequality, and perhaps in the discussion that we're leading into now, we might want to think about the relationship between these two terms, why there's been more of a focus on inequality, and what does a focus on poverty look like and mean. So in the last sort of years, I've been trying to stress 4 things in my work that perhaps signpost some new directions in the history of poverty. So firstly, the point that's been key to all of my work is that poverty is not only an economic condition, but a political concept, and crucially, that the existence of poverty as a political project precedes the birth of political economy in the 18th century. So this was the main thrust of my contribution to the introduction of the Routledge History of Poverty, and also my chapter on poverty and empire, which begins with Karl Polanyi's discussion of the politics of poverty, and then traces the longer intellectual and political history of poverty from the late Middle Ages, with the famous Franciscan poverty disputes, which I looked at in my early work, and to the role of poverty in the making of the Spanish and British imperial projects, which has been the subject of my more recent work. So I tend to focus on the 16th century in my work, so I think this is a really important moment for the interconnected processes of the transition to capitalism and the making of global imperialism, and also taking important steps in state formation. So the political history of poverty and its role in global empire formation is a central theme of my current monograph project entitled Empire of Poverty, the Moral Economy of the Spanish Empire. Now you can see from the title of this monograph that I'm interested in poverty not only as a subject of political economy, but also of moral economy. And this is central to the way in which I've been able to explore the history of poverty as a political project in the longue durée. So I look at the beliefs, laws, and institutions of poverty in the 16th century and how these shaped the emergence of the Spanish imperial state. So I'm arguing that the nation state, or the state of Spain and of empire were sort of co-constitutive and sort of need to be seen together. And also looking at the proto-racial contours of this Spanish imperial state and the way in which that's shaped by structures of poverty, laws, and institutions of poverty. So economics is important to understandings of poverty, but in my work I've focused less on the quantitative analysis and more on interrogating the history of economic thought and to understand how ideas about poverty and poverty reduction have become hegemonic, so how poverty is perceived and whose interest those kind of perceptions of poverty, what it means, and poverty reduction, whose interest they serve. So in my broader interdisciplinary work on inequality, I've been keen to shift the focus, the methodological focus, away from looking at the role of economic growth in thinking about poverty and inequality, and to understand the broader social and political making of poverty and inequality, focusing, for example, not so much on private property, but on common property institutions. And actually hearing John talk about his work on environment, thinking about, how different groups can access natural resources and so on, has been a focus of some of that work. So I've just finished a chapter for a project on markets and constitutions that's entitled Rethinking the Historic Relationship Between Constitutions and Inequality, which actually challenges some of the models at work in the new institutional economics and looks at the Iberian constitutional tradition and the way in which it protected certain common property traditions. So secondly, the second intervention I've sought to make in my work is that the history of poverty it changes in meaning and nature as societies change over time, and in particularly as societies have transitioned to capitalism. So I see this as quite key in the way that the meaning of poverty is changing. So I've recently written about this, the relationship between poverty and race, in a forthcoming chapter on the cultural history of poverty, and also in a short essay on the aesthetics of poverty. I look at the way in which kind of the rise of commodities and consumer culture is attached to different ways in which people can access resources, how this kind of affects identity, and we have this kind of proto-racialization of poverty in the early modern period. So I think that the intersection of class and race are really important to understanding the new directions in the history of poverty, and especially those focused upon the history of capitalism, understanding this in relation to the history of capitalism. So thirdly, and this is kind of what you'd expect me to say, poverty is both a global and a local phenomenon. And when studying poverty, I think it's really important to look at the ways in which the global and the local contexts intersect. So this has been the focus of my work on the Poverty Research Network. I'll put a link in the chat in just a moment. And that's a network that I founded in 2015. And we had a project called Beyond Development, the Local Histories of Global Poverty. And this aimed to get the narratives behind the numbers of representations of poverty that are kind of being put forward by the global development industry, to say there's a special edition coming out on this. Now, we held workshops around the world during this AHSC project in Senegal, Brazil, Bangladesh, Mexico, and Slovenia. And in each case, there was a theme set by the different location on kind of what mattered to them in sort of understanding the kind of politics of poverty. So thinking about kind of that local vision of global poverty. And it's really interesting to sort of see the different sort of agenda being set sort of from global different locations around the world. And I think that, like, trying to sort of develop a global conversation on what poverty means, and sort of transcending the sort of top-down definitions of global poverty that we've had from institutions like the World Bank and the IMF is really important. And this sounds all sort of very modernist focused, but as an early modernist, I've been kind of quite keen on looking at the ways in which deeper historical understanding can actually work to sort of, deepen those understandings of regional variations of poverty, and the ways in which, as I say, those local understandings of poverty are also globally connected to this kind of ongoing work of sort of global history here. So I think that global history is important to the new directions in the history of poverty, but I'd also say that poverty has been in global history's blind spot. So you do get sort of discussions of poverty in global history, but it's often been about the kind of neo-Malthusian ideas about how poverty and scarcity have driven global connections. And I think that there's kind of a real importance to understand how poverty is being made through global processes, and there's not it's kind of a product of those global processes rather than necessarily a cause of global processes, and also the kind of different local meanings and interactions of these kind of remakings of situations of poverty, and crucially also the theme of resistance, I think is key. How people have resisted both processes of impoverishment, but also processes of being labelled poor. So this aesthetics of poverty is something that I've really been interested in my work. And with the network, we did an exhibition on poverty, and we commissioned so filmmakers from around the world, from Senegal and Mexico and Scotland, to make short films that challenged the dominant representations and stigmatizing representations of poverty in various locations. And again, that's on the website, so I'll put a link in the chat and you can watch these videos. So at the moment, I'm organising a conference with the University of Queen's in Canada, and it's on poverty and scarcity in global history. The CFP will be available shortly, so if you're interested, please get in touch. Now, I'm plugging this conference in this context of this roundtable, because I think if people are interested in the new directions of the history of poverty, hopefully people will be also interested in these possible new directions in the global history of poverty. And as I say, there's a kind of preponderance towards the modern period in thinking about some of these questions. And I think it's really important to lengthen the analysis to get understanding from these critical periods of transition in the early modern period, the birth of global imperialism, this first transition to capitalism. And so if you've got interests such as this, do please get in touch for this forthcoming conference. So the other thing that I wanted to say about the global turn, or the context of global history as part of the future of the new directions in the history of poverty, is that it's not just this kind of scale of inquiry. I always say to my students, it's about a methodology. And so what's kind of unique to the methodology of global history? And I think one of the things is that it's concerned with transcending the anthropocentric perspective of traditional history. So within global history, objects, environment, landscapes, the natural world, such as trees and glaciers, all become historical actors. And so I think that's important sort of global history, but also what global history can bring to the new directions in the history of poverty. So at the moment, I'm pursuing this by running a sort of GCRF project out in Mexico, working with indigenous agroecological communities in the south of Mexico, in Chiapas. And we're looking at the relationship between people and the natural world, and how these relationships, these agroecological communities, have been important to resisting both colonialism and the racial logic of capitalism. So again, sort of taking a long history of kind of institutions, common property institutions in this case, but also oral histories of relationships with the natural world and what this tells us about different value regimes. And I think that the key thing about sort of thinking about the global history of poverty is to understand, to sort of pluralize our understanding of the different value regimes, rather than what the top-down perspectives of global poverty have done, which is to universalize a singular value regime, that of capitalism, and then sort of the emphasis then becomes on economic growth with all the environmental degradation that comes with it. So in connection with this, something else that I've been doing to develop this new direction in poverty history and poverty research, is recently co-founded a network on food sovereignty here in Glasgow. And we're working with radical growing collectives here in Glasgow and sort of thinking about the long process of loss of land. That means kind of there's a problem with food sovereignty, but also kind of the evolution of corporate food governance that kind of create this situation of food poverty that we have today, that is also kind of got long historical causations. So again, if anyone's interested in that, please get in touch. And we have an exhibition as part of the University of Glasgow's Arts Fringe of the COP26, which is held in October and November of this year. So do get in touch. So the final thing that I want to say about the importance of sort of global history in thinking about new directions in the history of poverty is that I think that interdisciplinary collaborations are really important. So I've worked in particular with legal scholars, and this kind of project that I mentioned before on markets and constitutions and thinking about common property institutions has been important to that. But I think that, you know, when we think about poverty in connection with human rights, poverty in relation to political structures, poverty in relation to geography, to climate, and so on, we sort of see that these new directions in the history of poverty, on the one hand, need to be sort of global and local, and on the other hand, need to be interdisciplinary. So I'll stop there, but hopefully this has given sort of some food for thought for the discussions that we can have now on the global history, sorry, the new directions in the history of poverty. Thanks, George.
Thanks, Julia. As well, and thank you to all three. That three really interesting papers, bringing up lots of very interesting well, themes and questions. There's so many interesting things there. As we might not be historians of poverty per se, we might not be early modernists, but there's a lot there that cuts across so much, I think, of what we're all doing as social historians. So we're having our virtual hand claps and real life ones as well, I think. So thank you all, and thank you for taking part in this final session of the strand for the Welfare Humanitarianism and Social Action strand. It's been a really interesting and useful day full of sessions. So thank you there, and hopefully see you all in real life next year. Thanks.